Okay, the idea of this video is to test out my RTX 2070 at 3440 by 1440p and decide, is it still up to the task in the year 2021 in new games, AAA games, graphically demanding, designed with like new consoles in mind, that kind of thing. Is this gonna be up to the task? Let's talk about my testing methodology. So I'm focusing on the game Cyberpunk 2077 as a stand-in for what future graphically demanding titles might look like, or what kind of demands will they place on a system over the next year or two. We obviously can't predict exactly what those will be, but I think Cyberpunk is similar to Crysis when it launched in the sense that it puts a unusually high demand on hardware and uses a lot of brand new features that we can test on and off. And again, I think that's one reason why we could use it to stand in for a worst case scenario of what kind of hardware demands we'll see placed on this video card in the near future. It's also very important to remember that we're using Cyberpunk as a stand-in for incredibly demanding or badly optimized games, not as a typical game. Here's Doom Eternal, for example, a recent game that is much better optimized. Look at the frame rate counter in the top right-hand side of the screen, and in combat, we are still hovering around that 100 frames per second mark. We do go below it, but we are never dropping anywhere near or below 60 frames per second. And just to prove it to you guys, this is at absolutely maxed out. We are at 3440 by 1440, and we are set to the graphic quality at Ultra Nightmare. Specifically, we're going to test different graphic settings, both with DLSS and without DLSS, because future games that are approximately this graphically demanding may or may not have DLSS implemented, so we should consider that. Also, we are going to look at, again, games that might have ray tracing and different levels of ray tracing implemented. And again, we can use Cyberpunk to simulate all of these possible demands. And again, I'm viewing this as a worst case scenario because, while I can't for sure predict the future, my guess would be that most games that launch over the next year or so will probably be at least somewhat less demanding than Cyberpunk, possibly due to better optimization or possibly just due to, reduced graphical demand. Okay, if you look at the top left side of the screen, you can see that I'm using MSI Afterburner to display the GPU usage, so you can tell that we are bottlenecked by the GPU and not my CPU, which happens to be an i5 9600K. If you're interested, at these resolutions, that should not be a bottleneck. At the top left side of the screen, you will also see 3 frame rate counters. The one on the far left is the current frame rate being displayed in the game right now. And the middle one is the average frame rate, which I can reset that average anytime I want. And then on the far right is the 1% lows. We're gonna jump right in here and take a look at what if we had a game as demanding as Cyberpunk that did not offer DLSS? What sorts of settings should we expect our RTX 2070 to run at? Well, if we take a look at the settings, let me prove to you what we're doing here. So under video, we are on full screen 3440 by 1440, and the graphics settings are at the Ultra preset with nothing changed and no DLSS or ray tracing enabled. Well, let me reset the average frame rate counter, since I was in a menu there for a second. Okay, the basic idea here is to kind of walk around and see what sorts of frame rates we're getting in a very much worst case scenario for this graphics card. You'll see that we are hovering in the mid 30s, mid to low 30s in the frames per second here in this kind of a demanding area. Now, whether or not you'd view this as playable is up to personal preference. I do know people who would be fine plugging in a controller to kind of smooth out the mouse movement and playing a game at 30 frames per second in order to have the ultra settings. That is totally up to you. Personally, I'd like to do a little bit better than this. Obviously, we could turn on DLSS, but remember, that's not what we're doing right now. We're simulating, we're not benchmarking Cyberpunk 2077 exactly. We're simulating games that would be this demanding that did not offer DLSS currently. So how would we do at a high preset? Let's drop it down and take a look. I'm gonna reset the frame rate counter. So by dropping down to the high preset, you'll notice that we've kind of moved from the low 40s to the high 40s in terms of the frames per second. Something that may not come across to you in the video itself, I can tell you, is the mouse latency. As your frame rate goes up, there's less milliseconds of response time in between moving your mouse and seeing a response on the screen. And I can tell you that while our frame rates here seem still very low, it feels noticeably better on this high preset than it did on the ultra preset. I still would prefer a better frame rate, but I would deem this as much more playable, just based on the input latency on my mouse movements. Okay, I think we've got enough to benchmark this. We're at about 38 frames per second average, so generally just kind of upper 30s. And like I said, feels somewhat playable, but definitely nowhere close to ideal. Let's drop this down to the medium preset. Again, I'll note that you could, obviously play around with individual graphics settings, not just using the presets, but this is just, again, giving us a rough idea of what we could get. All right, at the medium preset, I've reset that average. You'll notice that now we are averaging much closer to 50 frames per second, although we do drop into the upper 40s. Once again, I'll say there's a noticeable difference in the feeling of moving my mouse. It is, once again, drastically more responsive. I'll note that I have a variable refresh rate monitor, and we've now entered the territory on frame rates that it can keep up with. So I notice no screen tearing or anything like that, and that does help out. I would consider this perfectly playable. I would prefer the frame rate to be closer to 60, but when it's hovering around 50, I could live with this. So I would say that the 2070 in a game this graphically demanding, if it did not offer any DLSS options, I would consider medium very, very playable. And remember, there's sections of the game that are going to be much easier to do than this section. Now, what if we were willing to drop to the low preset? Let's just see what we get. I'm going to reset our frame rate counter. Okay. So, by dropping to the low preset, and notice in a game this graphically demanding, the low preset still looks fairly good. This by no means looks bad, right? Although certainly the higher presets look much better. We are now at 60 frames per second and above. Our average is more like the mid 60s. All right, let's now make our conclusion. If you're planning on playing the game, that's this graphically demanding, which we could see more of coming in the next year or two, on an RTX 2070 with no DLSS, so games that are this demanding with no DLSS, I would say that low feels very good and medium feels perfectly playable. I would probably be at the medium settings on a game like this if it did not offer DLSS. Now, realistically, in a game like this that does offer DLSS, that's what I'd use, and that's what we're going to test out next. So we're going to go back to Ultra, and now let's do it real quick again without DLSS, just to remind you what it was like without DLSS. So currently we are, remember, at the low to mid 30s in terms of our frame rate when we're at Ultra settings and no DLSS. Let's see what level of DLSS it would take to get us to reasonable frame rates and what sorts of trade-offs we get by enabling it. If we go down to the quality, remember, if you're not real familiar with DLSS, only certain games offer this because it's a machine learning algorithm that needs to be trained. And what it does is it lowers the internal rendering resolution of the game, but uses an AI, machine learning algorithm, to try to predict what your native resolution would look like if you were not using DLSS. Notice it gives you a massive frame rate boost. We are now up into the 50s already, and I would consider this absolutely playable. So, in a game that offers DLSS, by dropping down to the quality level, we're able to go from the low to mid 30s up to the low 50s in our frame rate, and suddenly it feels absolutely, totally playable. Now, you do get some sort of a graphical trade-off in terms of this. If you look closely, again, don't know how well this will translate to YouTube due to the compression, but everything is slightly grainier. It's almost like there's a little bit of a film over the screen, and no, it's not just the film grain in the game. I'm talking when you have DLSS on versus off. Textures and things are just slightly less sharp. It reminds me of when my glasses are slightly foggy or dusty. Another thing I'll mention is that if you look at straight lines, for example, if you look at the lines in the pavement here, especially if there's some motion, you should see some aliasing. Also, lines like on this street light here, these steps, especially in motion, and again, especially lines like these, you can notice some DLSS artifacts where it's having trouble predicting what things should look like just using the machine learning algorithm. Notice that if you stop moving, sometimes that improves, and sometimes screenshots are misleading as far as the trade-offs on this stuff, which leads to some people saying that DLSS actually looks better than not using it. I would completely disagree. You get these glitches, and like I said, everything looks kind of soft, a little bit blurred. All right. Now, if you wanted to, you could either drop down to an even further lowering of the internal rendering resolution. Balanced is probably the low I would personally go. I'm going to hit home again. And this now gets you to more of the mid to upper 50s rather than the lower 50s. Feels even smoother, although personally, I'd probably have stuck on the quality preset just to reduce some of the jaggies and such, but balanced is also perfectly fine. The image looks a little bit softer again, and you'll get a little bit more of the blurring of the lines, but this is now feeling very, very good. We're actually averaging right now, based on where we were just at, close to 60 frames per second. Now, alternatively, we could also lower the preset of the game. So we could go to the high preset. Once again, here's the high preset with DLSS off. High preset, DLSS off. Remember, we're hovering in the upper 30s. Once again, I'm noticing much, much worse mouse latency. Very choppy on a quick mouse movement. This is not how I'd prefer to play the game. So then we kick on DLSS. Once again, we can try the quality setting first. It takes just a moment to process here. And then I will kick on a reset to the frame rate counter. So high settings, high preset with the DLSS set to quality gets us into the 60 frames per second. By the way, this is actually how I did play Cyberpunk. If anybody's curious, I played it at ultrawide, high preset with DLSS to quality. So this is how I actually played the game. It feels very, very smooth. Okay, so let's make a conclusion about the ability of the RTX 2070 to keep up with a game that offers DLSS and is incredibly graphically demanding like this one. I would say that you would definitely want to use DLSS, and it makes you actually able to play the game at very, very comfortable frame rates in the 50s to 60s, depending on whether you go high or ultra, and whether you go DLSS quality or DLSS balanced. All right, now let's take a look at, can the RTX 2070 handle ray tracing at ultrawide 3440 by 1440? I'll tell you right now, I chose not to do that myself, but let's just look at how it goes. So let's start with ray tracing ultra and just, worst case scenario, what happens here? Now, notice it'll take a second for the ray tracing to process. That's why our shadows and reflections are processing here, okay? Once everything's processed, I'm gonna reset our benchmarking tool. I feel like I think we've got most things loaded in at this point. Okay, I'm gonna hit a reset on the benchmarker. Okay, you'll notice that by doing ray tracing ultra at this ultra wide resolution, the game is struggling. We are maybe averaging 30 frames per second. It's very choppy on the movement. It just doesn't feel good, guys. It just doesn't feel good. And notice that Ray Tracing Ultra is already using DLSS. Okay, this is already using DLSS. It's set to auto, which, by the way, I'm fairly confident is selecting the balanced preset. Here's why. If I come out of the menu, once again, I'm going to reset our frame rate counter. Notice we are achieving the same frame rates that we did when it was set to auto, which means I'm fairly confident that was set to balanced. By the way, what do you gain from ray tracing? Notice that you can now see nice mirrored reflections in these glass glass displays. You would also see that in puddles and things like that. They're very nice mirrored reflections, very crisp and clean. Also shadows. Shadows have soft edges. That's what the ray traced shadows do. These shadows have soft edges instead of harsh lines. And the lighting is more difficult to explain quickly, but it improves the realism of the lighting. Now, let's look at what happens if we turn this off for just a moment, just so you can once again see what heavy use of ray tracing actually gains you in a game. Notice our frame rate is instantly much better because it still has the DLSS set to balanced. Notice the edges on this shadow are now harsh instead of soft, meaning you go from having no shadow to shadow in a harsh line rather than a soft line. Notice that we no longer have extremely accurate mirrored reflections here. This side barely even gets a reflection at all. And these are screen space reflections, which, you know, look pretty nice, but they're nothing like the mirrored reflections that we got from the ray traced reflections. And overall, the lighting is somewhat less realistic. That's harder to explain clearly. So now the last thing I'll say about ray tracing here is that I felt like the ray tracing Ultra, so again, simulating a game that offers lots of ray tracing, was still not very playable, even with the DLSS set there to balance. Now, what you could do here, though, is play around with turning certain ray tracing features on or off. Reflections are extremely taxing. So if we turn off reflections and maybe turn the lighting down to medium, let's see if we get something that's a little bit more playable. I'm going to give that a moment to process. I'm now going to reset our frame rate counter. Okay, notice without the reflections, we're down to these screen space reflections. We don't get the nice mirrors. The shadows are giving us the softer edges to these shadows, which I guess looks nicer. And our frame rate is much more playable. I could play this. So if you're going to use ray tracing, and I'm not saying these are the ideal ray tracing settings, but I am saying I think that my conclusion here, let's make our conclusions about the RTX 2070 for ray traced games at this resolution. My conclusion is, personally, I'd probably leave most of the ray tracing off, or I would drop the resolution. Maybe I'd letterbox in and not play it at ultra-wide if I was going to use ray tracing on the 2070. Alternatively, you can do what I did here, which is take away some of the more demanding ray tracing settings and just use some of them and not others, and you get a playable experience here. Although whether you consider playing the game in the low 40s playable, well, that's up to you. I would consider it playable, but I would rather turn these settings off to gain a better frame rate. All right, let's now make my final conclusion about, there was a floating phone there or something. Anyway, let's make my final call on what I think about the RTX 2070 for 3440 by 1440 in the year 2021. Okay, I have to say that it's perfectly playable if you're willing to go down to high settings or maybe medium. And if you're in a game that offers DLSS, it's absolutely still going to get the job done. I don't think it's able to handle ray tracing at what I would consider playable frame rates. Your definition of playable frame rates might be different. Now, I will say once again that I think most games coming out are not going to be quite this demanding. So I'd say in the majority of games, you're probably going to be just fine, especially if you're playing older games that came out, 2020 and older, and then games that are better optimized. Like when I'm playing Doom Eternal, for example, I can max everything out at Ultra Nightmare and be well over 100 frames per second at this resolution. So I'll let this guy pass me here. So my overall conclusion is, compared to normal 1440p, where I said, yeah, I think the RTX 2070 is just fine, I've got to say that at ultra-wide, I would prefer leaning towards getting a new GPU sooner than later for the absolutely most demanding games coming out now. But I'm also going to say I'm not in a rush. I'm still probably going to wait until I see what the next line of GPUs from Nvidia and AMD have to offer. Because, like I said, I was able to play a game like Cyberpunk that does feature DLSS, with the high preset, with quality DLSS, getting pretty much 60 frames per second in most, or better in most locations of the game. So, I'd predict that that's what we'll see in most future games coming up, and we're going to be good to go. What do you guys think in the comments section? Let me know.